Hello, good afternoon, and welcome everybody to this web conference that we're doing past the British Consulate in Boston to mark the opening of COP26 in Glasgow. My name is Peter Abbott. I'm the British Consul General to New England, and I issue a very, very warm welcome to all of you this afternoon. I want to kick off just by saying a few words of thanks, primarily to Paolo Di Fabio and Hannah Webb at the Consulate, and Kyle Stetson at Port Live for helping us pivot at the last minute from an in-person event to a virtual event. Many of you will be familiar with this pivot over the last few weeks. It's a great shame not to be able to gather in person, but I think doing it virtually means we do manage to reach a much bigger number of people. I wanted also to say at the outset that this live streaming is being recorded as part of the UK's overall programming of events at COP26 in Glasgow and around the world. We need little reminding of the starkness of the situation that our world is facing. If we don't act immediately, by the end of the century, we will warm the world by at least 3 degrees centigrade. This would cause the number of extreme weather events to increase significantly, leading to catastrophic flooding and wildfires and wholesale destruction of species. And we know that those who are disproportionately affected by climate change and are least able to cope with its effects are those who contribute least to it: communities of colour, lower socioeconomic groups, and those at the margins of our societies. COP26 is the last best chance for humanity to protect people and nature, to get finance flowing to support climate action, and to limit the rise in global temperatures to well below 2 degrees centigrade. COP26 is the largest gathering that the UK has ever hosted, with around 140 heads of state or government and 25,000 delegates, many of whom are from New England. Opening the conference in Glasgow yesterday, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said, "Humanity has long since run down the clock on climate change. It is 1 minute to midnight on that clock, and we need to act now." During World War II, one of Boris Johnson's great heroes, Winston Churchill, kept on his desk a large rubber stamp, which he would use to mark in red ink documents pertaining to the most urgent, important issues. That stamp read, "Action this day." And that is what we need. Action this day, not next month, not next year, but now. I don't know if Maura Healey has a rubber stamp like that on her desk, but her career has certainly been defined by a similar sense of urgency. Early in that career, she helped to shut down predatory lenders and protected women from being harassed outside reproductive health centres. Since becoming Attorney General in 2015, Maura Healey has tackled the abuse of heroin and prescription drugs, sought to rein in rising healthcare costs, protected workers' rights, strengthened consumer protections, and sought to improve the criminal justice system. And she has increasingly led efforts to tackle environmental justice across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. She's no slouch outside the courtroom either. In 2006, she was inducted to the New England Basketball Hall of Fame, and more recently was spotted on TikTok riding a skateboard whilst drinking cranberry juice and listening to Fleetwood Mac, apparently to encourage folks to get out and vote. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to invite our keynote speaker this afternoon, Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey.
Well, good afternoon, Peter. Consul General, thank you so much for inviting me to be with you today. It is a real honor for me and for our team in the Attorney General's office. And I just want to thank you for the commitment that you have shown to addressing climate change and to environmental justice. Since your arrival here in Boston, you and your team have prioritized climate and equity issues. You've reached out to and listened to those on the front lines of the fight for environmental justice. You even had our team out on a boat recently looking at Chelsea Creek and the Boston Harbor. Just an example of the ways in which you're really out and about and so there. And you've also worked outside of Massachusetts, working with New England states to advance clean energy goals, clean energy technologies, and to support our efforts to achieve carbon neutrality. We've had the privilege of working with you and your team, Paolo DeFabio and Hannah Webb. Thank you both for your work on these important issues. And we really appreciate you bringing us all together today. It's an honor to be with the panelists too, who I'm looking forward to hearing from shortly. I also have members of my team joining on the call today, Rebecca Tepper, who is our terrific Chief of Energy and Environment, and Elizabeth Mahoney, who is just a stellar leader in our office, policy advisor and assistant attorney general. Not with us today is our former Energy and Environmental Bureau Chief, Melissa Hoffer, as she is busy now serving as general counsel to the Environmental Protection Agency in the Biden administration. But Rebecca, Elizabeth, the entire team is really engaged in the issues of environmental justice and working to combat climate. So though the Consul General gave me kudos for my work, know that it's really their work. And to them, I am particularly grateful for their leadership, their courage, and their unwillingness to stand down to rich, powerful interests, particularly those in the fossil fuel industry. Today, it is just so fitting that it is the British consulate that is hosting this event, because as you all know, the United Kingdom is a world leader in tackling and adapting to climate change. In the 1800s, the UK was the first country in the world to generate electricity from coal. Now it has committed to phasing out coal completely by 2024. Yes, America, by 2024. And on an issue near and dear to our hearts here in Massachusetts, the UK is now the largest producer of offshore wind energy in the world. 60% of the UK's energy mix is coming from wind. As we look to develop our own offshore industry here in Massachusetts, we are looking to the UK and its success to help shape our efforts. And as we speak, of course, COP26 is happening right now in Glasgow. I say these points with hopes that they will inspire the competitive juices of my American colleagues out there, as we need to and can do so much more. As world leaders meet right now in Scotland, the world is still reeling from a summer of climate calamities. Raging wildfires in Canada, the Western United States, and across Europe, deadly flooding and record-breaking rainfalls in Europe and China, deadly heat waves stressing our power and public health systems. And for the first time, the precipitation at the summit of Greenland fell as rain and not snow. There's simply no doubt that climate change is here and it's getting worse. The world's best scientists, doctors, and security experts are all calling on the world to take drastic action to wean off of fossil fuels. The International Energy Agency says the world needs to radically transform how we produce, transport, and use energy. The world's doctors have declared that the climate crisis is the #1 public health emergency facing the globe today. Financial regulators and central banks are saying that climate change is a leading threat to financial stability. And the US Secretary of Defense warns that no nation can find lasting security without addressing the climate crisis. Now, COVID-19 has given us a stark preview of what's in store for our most vulnerable communities if we don't pick up the pace in our fight against climate change. Now, last year, my office released a report detailing some of the disparate impacts of COVID in Massachusetts. Boston University School of Public Health analyzed data compiled by our office that showed that communities of color had the highest rates of COVID infection across some of the largest cities in Massachusetts. Researchers at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health also issued a study that linked long-term particulate matter air pollution to COVID-19 death rates. And just a few weeks ago, Green Roots Chelsea, you'll soon hear from their fabulous executive director, Rose Bongiovanni. Green Roots issued a case study into why Chelsea was one of the hardest hit communities in the country with COVID. It found that factors such as pre-existing diseases like asthma and high exposure to air contaminants like nitrogen oxide and particulate matter made residents more vulnerable to the disease. It's that type of air pollution that many environmental justice communities struggle with every day, whether it's from highways or power plants or concentration of industrial facilities in their neighborhoods. These disparities, these social determinants of health are the predictable and endpoint of decades of policy choices that incentivize economic, housing, and environmental injustice. The impacts of COVID and this summer's weather events proved to the world once again that we have both a climate and an environmental equity crisis. They're reminding us, crying out to us, that we need to meet this critical moment with transformative rapid change to the policies and systems that have shaped our choices for far too long. And we need to be doing it at every level of government. And I mean every level of government, local, state, national, and international. Now, President Biden knows the importance of equitable climate action. Today in Glasgow, the president announced a new $3 billion financing program to help developing countries adapt to climate change. And equity is at the center of the long-term strategy he issued today, which outlines how the US will cut carbon emissions in half by 2030 and achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Here in Massachusetts, we're confronting these challenges. We've enacted groundbreaking laws that chart a course for our economy to have our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and achieve net zero emissions by 2050. My office and other Democratic attorneys general held the line and fought back in court to protect our state's efforts from the Trump administration's illegal, unconstitutional, and harmful, most importantly, rollbacks of environmental protections. And we worked to stop the worst from happening. Last year, my office filed a petition with the Department of Public Utilities calling for an investigation to proactively manage our transition, our needed transition away from natural gas. And that investigation is now underway. We need to make sure that our low-income residents don't get stuck footing the bill for an outmoded, soon-to-be obsolete system, while wealthier ratepayers can afford to electrify with air source heat pumps and the like. And I want to thank groups like Green Roots, Neighbor to Neighbor, the Conservation Law Foundation, Alternatives for Community Environment, and others working so hard to make legislative progress on environmental justice. New legislation codifies the principles of environmental justice into state law. There is now a definition, for example, for what an environmental justice community is. And the law gives those communities a greater voice in the state approval process for projects that may affect them. We have an opportunity right now in Massachusetts and in New England to seize this moment, to act to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to improve the quality of life and public health in EJ communities. Here's how we get there. First, we need to strengthen requirements to protect our environmental justice communities and vulnerable neighborhoods. This means better air quality monitoring, better health data, and a better process for regulatory permitting and siting decisions. As Attorney General, I have committed to using the full extent of my authority to enforce the climate protective laws already on the books, to stop illegal pollution, and to penalize the polluters that put our communities at risk. Second, we need to invest massively in clean energy. Transitioning our energy system to affordable, clean energy like wind, solar, storage, and energy efficiency is good for consumers, good for the climate, good for public health, and yes, good for the economy. In doing this, we must prioritize and lower the barriers to new clean energy investments in low-income communities and communities of color. And we need to develop a pipeline for good-paying clean energy jobs through worker training and education. Third, we need to stop investing in fossil fuels. The International Energy Agency has told us in no uncertain terms There is no fossil fuel bridge to climate safety. Every dollar spent on fossil fuels buys us climate disruption, human suffering, and property damage. Fourth, we need to say goodbye to the combustion engine. We need to electrify. We need to electrify our transportation sector, especially making sure that the benefits of clean transportation are equitably shared. This includes expansion and electrification of public transit systems, school transportation, and robust ride-sharing programs. Finally, we need to increase building energy efficiency and stop heating our buildings with fossil fuel. This is going to require concrete and ambitious steps to equitably expand heat pump access to EJ communities, as well as to low and moderate income renters and homeowners. At COP26, in the halls of Congress, and here in the Commonwealth, this is our time to get this right, to make the choices to build the clean energy future we need for our communities, our health, our economy, and our planet. There is opportunity ahead of us to achieve this, to get this done, and this is our moment. This is all linked together, our common humanity, and how well we do in this moment is going to affect us now and for generations to come. I'm so heartened to see those of you who are on this program this afternoon. I know you're working hard on so many important fronts, and I want to commend you for your efforts and to also say, don't be discouraged. It is most unfortunate that there is one senator in a relatively small state who seems to be presenting all sorts of difficulty, Peter, in the efforts underway here in this country to advance us in our transition away from fossil fuel. But none of us should be daunted or deterred, because every day there are ways for us to take action at the local, state, and federal level. And the team and I in the Attorney General's office are redoubling our efforts to work alongside and stand alongside all of you in the fight for environmental justice, for human rights, and for the betterment of our world. Thank you again for having me, Consul General.
Thank you very much indeed, Attorney General, for those words and for that stirring ending, which I think is really important. We do need to be stirred to action, and all of the extraordinary work that you and your fantastic team are doing is really testament to, I think, the way that Massachusetts can lead the United States and help to lead the world in tackling climate change. We're going to move now to a panel discussion to talk about some of the issues that the Attorney General has raised. And to do that, we have assembled a group of 4 really fantastic speakers for you this afternoon, many of whom have worked with the Attorney General before here in Massachusetts, know about her work and know how fantastic it has been. I am going to introduce our panelists very briefly and then start with a question which follows on from what the Attorney General has just spoken about. So first I want to introduce Jennifer Menard. Jen is Vice President of Economic and Business Development at Bristol Community College, an institution that has been at the forefront of developing skills and training needed for a new generation of jobs in clean, renewable energy. Also on the panel alongside Jen is Matt O'Malley. Matt is president of the Boston City Council and has championed many progressive causes during his career, including introducing legislation to give consumers access to renewable energy, ban plastic bags, protect local wetlands, and to require large buildings in the city of Boston to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Alongside Jen and Matt, we have Roseanne Bongiovanni. Roseanne, welcome. Roseanne is Executive Director of Green Roots, an extraordinary organisation that the Attorney General referred to in her remarks and that I've had the privilege of getting to know over the last few months. Roseanne has dedicated her life's work not just to Green Roots, but to Chelsea itself and to promoting and pursuing environmental justice for that community and others. And finally, we welcome to the panel Kerry Bowie. Kerry, who we've worked with before, is president of Browning the Green Space, a coalition that seeks to deliver a fair share of in what he calls environmental goods to communities of colour, including renewable energy and clean water, as well as to help drive up participation of underrepresented communities in the environmental sector. All of you, a very, very warm welcome to the panel this afternoon, and thank you very much indeed for giving up your time to participate. I'm going to start with you, Matt, if that's okay, and I want to follow up, as I said, on something that the Attorney General mentioned in her comments, and that's about housing. In September, Governor Baker introduced something called the Clean Heat Commission, looking at how the Commonwealth of Massachusetts can reduce emissions from home heating fuels. The Attorney General mentioned heat pumps, and as we know that heat pumps linked to renewable sources of electricity can be a great way to reduce your carbon footprint. What's your experience of climate justice in the housing sector in Boston?
Well, thank you, Consul General, for the question. Thank you for convening us all today. It's always great to be with you, with my fellow panelists, and to hear from the remarkable Attorney General Maura Healey, who's been such a leader in this space. It's a great question. I'm going to answer it by noting the fact that when you look at a coastal city like Boston, if we want to talk about getting serious about reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, we have to look at buildings. We have to look not only at housing, but at commercial enterprise as well. It's one of the reasons why I was so grateful as my time on the council comes to an end in a couple of months. We have a big election in the city tomorrow. I'm not running for re-election, but I was very grateful that my colleagues and I were able to pass the Building Emissions Reduction and Disclosure Ordinance, or BERDO 2.0, earlier this fall. And it culminates on the work I began 8 years ago with former Mayor Tom Menino when Boston put forth the first BERDO. The acronym was slightly different then. It was the Building Energy Reporting and Disclosure Ordinance. And we were simply looking at having buildings report their utility usage. And it was very controversial at the time. There was a lot of opposition, and it seems rather meek at this point. But we were able to get it passed, and a funny thing happened after adoption is that we saw buildings taking their own initiative to decarbonize, because they recognize that almost always, if you're going to lower your greenhouse gas emissions, you will save money. And it seems too good to be true with many folks. As we talk about housing, and as we talk about affordable housing specifically, to build green, we will save on utility costs for the residents who live there. So it's incredibly important. The fact that that you've convened us all today to talk about environmentalism through the equity lens is really what drove our work on BERDO 2.0. We are not the first city in the world to do a decarbonization bill. I would argue we're one of the best in the world to do it, because rather than having alternative compliance payments or penalties that go into the general fund, we've established an equity emissions fund where that money that's collected through implementation of this ordinance will go back to make sure that we can focus on EJ communities for more affordable housing, for basic infrastructure. It's great I share the call and drive an electric vehicle, but we need a heck of a lot more charging stations in our neighborhoods, in our municipal parking lots, to make sure that we can offer incentives so that an individual can upgrade to an air source heat pump, as well as make smaller steps initially to decarbonize and to make greener buildings. But the premise of your question is a great one. And there is an inextricable link between housing, between building strong, sustainable, affordable, and robust housing, and doing it through the lens of equity. And it's one thing that really has to drive our work. And we have seen a sea change in how we're able to really focus on environmentalism as a society. When I first introduced the plastic bag ban, I couldn't get one other counselor to even agree to hear me out on it, because they thought it would be political kryptonite. Clearly, that's not the case. People want to do this. They recognize that we need to do everything that we can, and through aggressive policies is really the way that we're going to do it. But appreciate your question, appreciate the incredible work of the other people on the panel who've worked really, really hard in this space as well.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Matt. There's a sort of follow-up comment really coming from our experience in the UK, that we found it relatively easy to build green from the ground up. What's harder is to retrofit older properties, particularly where there might be a tenant-landlord relationship. The landlord isn't particularly interested in investing in heat pumps, and if he or she does invest in heat pumps, then you also have to invest in insulation and new windows and things to stop the heat coming from those heat pumps dispersing. And that can be much more difficult, I think, for EJ communities to, many of whom, as I said, live in that sort of tenant-landlord relationship. I just wondered if you had any sort of reflections on how that has worked in your time in Boston, trying to work with the older building stock rather than just necessarily the newer building stock.
So two ways to answer that. The first is I was able to include in this year's budget, it's a relatively modest amount, but I hope it will grow in future budgets, a $500,000 commitment that will be set up to a fund that individuals, needs-based fund, can apply for some city funding to help with these costs right off the bat. So if someone who may own their own home, but recognizing the incredible cost of running a home, wants to make some of those energy efficiencies now, there will be some money ahead. And we've done this at the state in terms of incentives for an individual who wants to buy or lease an electric car. So there has to be some better partnership with state, with city government as well. But to the larger issue, one thing that we did when we passed BERDO is we set five-year different metrics that individuals would have to reach. So we're not suggesting that every building has to completely decarbonize by 2030 or even 2040. We have that 25-year goal endpoint at 2050, recognizing smaller changes can be made now to increase efficiencies. We put different buildings in different categories. For example, a self-storage facility wouldn't have the same metrics as a hospital. And we allow for ways to lower the greenhouse gas emission targets in every 5 years. Eventually, when they need to replace a boiler, we hope and we encourage and we expect that they will do so with an air source heat pump or with other costs or with other technology as it continues to grow. And it will be more affordable. I mean, PV panels alone have dropped in price to install in a new building by something like 70% over the last 10 or 15 years. So we are seeing the marketplace become a lot more competitive. There certainly should be some incentives from government to encourage this because, again, you will save money on your utilities to do so. But at the end of the day, we need to hold these larger buildings accountable. BERDO only accounts for 4% of Boston's building stock, but that 4% of buildings account for nearly 60% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And quite frankly, as we talk about the cost that will be for these buildings, there will be a cost, but there's no other option at this point. We need to have a policy in place that's aggressive, but it also is achievable.
Great, thank you, Matt. I want to go from the built environment to the green environment now. And Roseanne, I'm going to turn to you if that's okay. The Attorney General referred to a fantastic boat ride that I took up Chelsea Creek a couple of months ago to see some of the infrastructure that sits around Boston Harbor, around the entrance to Chelsea Creek, that really does affect the communities that you represent. You've done a huge amount to promote green spaces in Chelsea, including helping raise money for the Creekside Commons Park and setting up urban gardens and urban farms and things. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what some of the benefits that you're seeing as a result of setting up those green spaces for environmental justice communities like Chelsea?
Yes, sure. Peter, thank you so much for the invitation to join you today. It's a pleasure to work with you. And I just have to say, amen to the Attorney General. She is an amazing leader and rock star, and I feel so grateful to have her on our team here in Massachusetts. So, thank you, Attorney General, and your whole staff who are working tirelessly side by side with us on the front lines. Thank you for the question, Peter. We've recognized, I think we all know, that green space adds so much to our individual quality of life. But what we've really seen over the past 18 to 20 months is just how much a difference green space can make in terms of public health and public health statistics and outcomes. The Attorney General referenced a report that Green Roots published a few weeks ago called COVID-19 in Chelsea, a glance into one of the hardest hit communities, and the role the intersecting social determinants of health played. And essentially what we realized in Chelsea and communities like Chelsea and East Boston were that we were some of the most hard hit by COVID-19. So we've been saying, for years that communities, frontline environmental justice communities like Chelsea would be hit first and worst. And we always thought that that would be a climate event. We never knew that we would be hit so hard by a global pandemic. But what we learned over the last 18 to 20 months is that had we had more open space and more tree canopy cover in communities like Chelsea and other frontline communities, we would have had a better likelihood of coming through COVID less scathed, if you will. Chelsea had some of the highest infection rates in the entire state and per capita in the nation. And we really look to to the lack of open space and tree canopy cover as some of the social determinants and the reasons why our community was so impacted. In my hometown of Chelsea, we're the smallest city in the entire state at 1.8 square miles, but in our 1.8 square miles, we're one of the most densely populated, almost 50,000 residents living within less than 1.8 square miles. Only 4% of our entire city is green space. Only 2% of our city is tree canopy cover, and almost 80% of our community is impervious. And so we know that even though we've been working tirelessly with valiant efforts to advocate and develop more open green space, to advocate for and actually plant thousands of trees, we're still woefully under the recommended averages for all of that open space and tree canopy cover. And so we know, as we're looking at climate impacts now and future climate impacts, that the lack of open space that frontline communities and communities of color have are going to be just so detrimental to our health and long-term well-being. And so that's why it's so utterly important that we prioritize green space and tree canopy cover as we move forward, thinking long-term about climate justice.
Thank you. That's it's really heartening to hear that you've been able to have that kind of impact with some of those green spaces that you've set up. From my time on Chelsea Creek and working with you and with the Mystic River Watershed Association and Climbable and others who work in this space, I know there are some fantastic stories of people who are just doing amazing things almost against the odds. Well, I mean, yes, literally against the odds. I wondered if you wanted to share kind of one or two of your favorites stories of community projects that have really sort of captured your imagination or captured your heart.
Yeah, sure. Let's see, there are so many, right? I think what we say in our communities is that we're always fighting, but what happens then is that we've gotten really good at fighting. And so we're fighting always for wins. One of my favorite stories is that there was a proposal to site a dirty diesel power plant on the banks of the Chelsea Creek. The very same proponent who was proposing clean renewable energy for Nantucket was proposing a dirty diesel power plant on the banks of our waterfront, right adjacent to Chelsea's only elementary school complex, where all children in grades 1 through 4 attend. And with community power through protest and negotiations and letter writing campaigns and attending public meetings and every tactic in the organizer's playbook, we were able to prevent that power plant from being sited. And now, just about 10 years later, we're planning new magnificent public access to the Chelsea Creek at that space where community members, it's our first in-person meeting in May this year, where we brought dozens of residents out to imagine a new green space along that waterfront and to connect it up to our elementary school. So it's a real testament to people power. And one more quick story, if I can. Through that power plant campaign, we had learned just how dire Chelsea's statistics were, our health statistics and our air quality. And so we said, this is an amazing victory, but we can't just sit back on our laurels. What are we going to do about this? And so we saw an opportunity to address the serious air quality concerns that already existed. We reached out to the New England Produce Center, and with some federal stimulus dollars then through the ARA program, we were able to engage the New England Produce Center and some area businesses, and we replaced or retrofitted 132 dirty diesel engines, which resulted in 2,000 tons of annual air pollutants being removed for our local air. We need to just continue to do more and more and more of that.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic, Roseanne. Thank you very much. Before we move on to our next panelist, and I'll give Kerry the heads up that it's going to be him. I would say that for those of you listening, if you do have questions, please drop them into the chat bar, and we will get around to answering them. You've got a great resource here of folks who are involved in lots of different ways in the climate justice piece. So do ask your questions, pop them in the chat bar. I want to move slightly to the question of sort of private investment. And Kerry, I'm going to turn to you and ask about this. You got your MBA from MIT in 2006, I think. And I'm going to quote you. I found this on the internet. I hope it's correct. That you said that you're as comfortable in Nubian Square as you are in Kendall Square. And so I guess my question really is around the involvement of communities of color in innovation and tech, but also in finance, as the the venture capital community is kind of critical to help fund some of the new innovations that can help tackle some of these environmental questions. Tell us a little bit about how would you react to that statement and kind of your work in this area?
Yes, happy to do so, and thank you for the invitation. And I echo Roseanne's remarks about the Attorney General. I'm formerly with the Mass Department of Environmental Protection. I was the Director of Brownfields and Environmental Justice, so got to work with a number of her staff back then and love what she's doing. So yes, I did complete my MBA in 2006 from MIT Sloan. And that actually was a really interesting time. And I think that sort of goes to what you were talking about. Got to, we started the MIT Energy Conference when I was there. There were a lot of things going on. President Hockfield was the president at the time, and she was pushing, energy and biotech, and how could we really do that work? And that's when I was fortunate enough to go and work for Governor Patrick, and then also worked for Governor Baker for a little bit. And I think, as Roseanne is talking about, all of the environmental bans, the asthma, the brownfields, the pollution, all of that work, from a business perspective, what really got me was, like, I knew that stuff was there and we got to keep working on that. But really what got me from a business perspective was missing out on the environmental goods. So missing out on the green jobs, the energy efficiency jobs, all the things that, you talked about with Matt. If we think about where, the jobs and where the opportunities are, it's, here in New England, it's, it's those deep energy retrofits, on the energy efficiency side, and it's offshore wind on the renewable side, right now, in addition to solar and some of the other things. Those are the two big ones. And there's an opportunity to connect environmental justice with social justice and economic justice. So the problems that we're working on, why can't we get Black and brown and low moderate income people to be a part of that solution? Get them high paying jobs so they can, because at base about this, definitely it's race, ethnicity, language. A lot of this goes to economics and income. And so I'm sure if Roseanne talked about Chelsea, it's an EJ community because it's also a lower income community. They're not having, you don't have the money to do those things. And so it's really, really important. So at Browning and Green Space, one of my co-founders is Dan Goldman. He's at Clean Energy Ventures. And so they're a VC fund. And so I think they recognize that. And one of the things that we're trying to do is make sure that when we brown the green space, it's also in the capital world and in the contracts world, around supplier diversity. So how do we work with Clean Tech Open Northeast? How do we work with Greentown Labs and others to make sure that we are doing that work, with startups and small businesses to really, bring about a just energy transition, because we're doing it. We're doing it, and I know it's going to get done. What I'm most concerned about right now is that there are some Black and brown people, taking advantage of that when it happens.
Thanks, Kerry. Fantastic. We're going to move to Jen now for the last sort of panelist commentary, and then we're going to open it up to questions. Just again to say, if folks listening want to ask questions, do drop them in the chat bar. Jen, Kerry talked about the kind of the economic and jobs implications of the economic justice discussion. Bristol Community College, as I said in my introduction to you, has been really at the forefront through the National Offshore Wind Institute of training and providing skills for folks who are looking to get into the offshore wind sector. Tell us a little bit about Fall River and New Bedford, where Bristol Community College is situated. What are some of the challenges of ensuring that the benefits of the offshore wind industry, which the UK Consulate has done a lot to kind of trumpet and support, how can you make sure those benefits are shared equitably across a community like you see around Bristol Community College?
Well, first, I just want to thank the Consul General Peter Abbott for inviting me and having me here today, as well as my esteemed panelists, and of course the Attorney General, who was amazing and really appreciated her remarks, and of course the Consul's staff, who just helped so much for today. But I love the question, and I'm going to steal the energy goods comment, Carrie, because I think that's really what all Bristol Community College is about, looking at bringing good stuff to folks that may not have that opportunity. We are, as you know, community colleges, we are the ones that touch the community the most. And for over a decade, we've been watching offshore wind. We started our associate's degree over a decade ago, knowing that we wanted our residents to have that opportunity at the diverse amount of jobs that come out of offshore wind through the OEMs and supply chain, and so many opportunities. But we also know that we can't just sit back on our laurels and just expect people to figure that out. And so Bristol Community College, number one, has an offshore wind certificate as well as a associate's degree. But we started the National Offshore Wind Institute knowing that we needed really a much bigger strategy around getting not just our residents, which of course is a big, huge, important part of it, and looking at how we can train a U.S. workforce, but looking at how we can bring residents from groups that may not have these opportunities. Bristol, the National Offshore Wind Institute had 2 different programs just this year focused on equity. One, a speaker series looking at women in offshore wind. And the second, which is really one that I'm really excited to talk about, which is access to opportunity. We are right now starting a marketing campaign looking at the educational and career pathways into offshore wind. And we're working with 4 community organizations that are folks that are in those underrepresented populations that can help us get the word out on here are the ways to get into these opportunities right from the beginning in high school, in lower level, K through 12, and then how then they can, and then what's that opportunity? What are the different kinds of jobs they can get into, and what can they make a real workable living? And we are working with guidance counselors and looking at different groups throughout the community. And we know this pilot can be then replicated throughout the state as an opportunity to see and show folks why it's interesting and really a great way to get into this field. The National Offshore Wind Institute is looking at professional development for individuals and businesses in our community, how they can get into the offshore wind sector, particularly minority-based businesses, as well as starting an innovation and entrepreneurship program next year that's going to be looking at entrepreneurs and small and medium businesses with a focus on equity.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jen. As I said, we've done a lot of work in the offshore wind sector over the last year or so since I have been here in Boston. And I have to say, a lot of the folks I work with are pretty white and pretty male, not exclusively, but as a sector, the offshore wind sector is pretty white and pretty male. I love all of them. They're all fantastic, but there is still some way to go to diversify that particular sector. So we've got a couple of great questions that have come in. The first one I wanted to ask, and I think, Matt, I'll start with you, but then please others join in. The question is, how do communities get access to regulatory processes, including representation, so that they can effectively impact projects, not just oppose them after the fact? Which I think is really interesting. And Roseanne, I think it relates back to something you said. It can't always just be about opposing stuff. You have to get people in there at the beginning to be creative about the solutions that fit them and their communities. I'm not going to prejudge or put words in your mouth, but Matt, over to you for a first answer.
Yeah, I will keep it brief because I'm seeing a lot of my colleagues shaking their head in agreement. It's a great question, and I appreciate it being asked. I will tell you just anecdotally, a large part of being a city councilor is managing progress. Is anytime there's a new development, we'll often go through the community process. Folks will come out. I think that the question I think leads a truthhood to this, which is that it's often the same people showing up at the same community meetings, civic associations. One good thing about Zoom meetings is you've seen more voices, more people weighing in on civic decisions. So It used to be that one of the few things that would come out, there'd be a large housing development, for example, that would come up in part of my district, and you would have a number of individuals show up and say, we want to really push the affordable housing commitment on this, which is important. You'd have other groups say, we want to make sure that there is a neighborhood space. If there's a community room, for example, a neighborhood group could access it from time to time. Also a really important issue. You never really heard folks say, we want this to be an energy efficient building. We want this to be a green building, until you had one of the utilities put in a 750 PSI pipeline in West Roxbury, which is part of my district. It ran directly across the street from the only active quarry in the city of Boston. I opposed it. Mayor Walsh at the time opposed it. Every elected official worth his or her salt opposed it. And that began to change the conversation, that you had civically engaged residents who felt strongly as we did on the importance of building green and moving away from fossil fuels, to then get commitments out of the new developer, a developer who was pitching this 200 unit development in West Roxbury, not too far from this building, to go all electric. And they agreed because we were able to really ratchet up the public pressure. Roseanne had mentioned sort of the letter writing campaign and organizing. That is such a crucial part to it. And we need to make sure it's just not the same voices in the room, that people get involved and recognize that by getting to know your local elected official, by getting to be part of the community process when there's a new project for your neighborhood, that you show up, that you ask the tough questions, and you really exert public pressure to make it green. Not only will it in all likelihood have a better chance of going through the permitting process, but from a financial investment, individuals are going to be looking to that in terms of where they rent office space or residential space. So it's showing up, it's getting involved, it's knowing who the players are and making sure that you have your voice heard. It can't just be signing on to a change.org petition or sending out a pre-written email. You need to do a little bit of the work, which now there's a lot more interaction virtually. So you're able to do that, because the fact of the matter is people have lives, they have kids, they have work. They can't necessarily commit to 3 hours twice a week at community meetings, but at least now there's an opportunity to weigh in, and it will be absolutely impactful.
Great, Matt, thank you. I guess one of the challenges is helping people feel comfortable about weighing in the first place, and about figuring out, what the channels are for those who just aren't used to doing that. But I just wanted to open it up to any of our other panelists, whether you wanted to comment on anything Matt said or have a go at answering the question.
Is it okay for me to chime in, Peter?
Yeah, go for it, Rosa.
Thanks. I would argue that we're not doing a good enough job making these public processes known to communities, especially environmental justice communities. And I think that's why the environmental justice legislation that we were able to pass this last year is so critically important. There needs to be more effort to reach out to impacted communities to make sure they know about the opportunity to participate in these public processes, and the process is equitable. And that means through language access, through different modes of communication, whether it be by telephone or Zoom or in person. What we've experienced in our communities is that a few folks might read the legal notices in the local newspapers or even in the regional newspapers. They'll read very fine print that there's some, project that might be threatening to the community. They'll bring it to organizations like Green Roots. Green Roots digs in, and then we share that information back with the community. If that infrastructure didn't exist, if there was that one community member that wasn't reading the legal notices and there wasn't a community-based partner to share out the information, how would community members know? They effectively wouldn't know. And so these projects would likely just be permitted and appear from one day to the next in environmental justice communities. And so we've been pushing very hard with partners on this panel and the Attorney General's office and other partners like Conservation Law Foundation and Lawyers for Civil Rights to argue that effectively residents' civil rights are being violated if we're not providing meaningful, equitable public access for folks to be involved in these processes. And like I said, that's through meetings in the evening. If they're in person, they're providing childcare, they're providing simultaneous interpretation. The notices are shared out in multiple different languages, that there's door-to-door outreach to community members and neighborhoods who are impacted. It needs to be that extensive. The owners should really be on the project proponent to make sure that they are going out and doing everything possible to inform the potentially impacted neighborhoods, but if there's no enforcement mechanism or no pressure put on that project proponent, they're not likely to fulfill all of those requirements.
Great, thank you, Roseanne. Jen or Kerry, do you want to contribute, or
Yeah, I'll jump in really quickly, and we can get into a whole lot of details. I was the former director of environmental justice, and Roseanne and I have gone back and forth on some of this when I was wearing my suit back in the day. But when we get to it, it's all about procedural justice, distributive justice, restorative justice, and in some senses retributive justice. Like, how are we making sure that everyone is taken care of, and really, to what Roseanne is talking about, how do we make sure people are heard, and people in communities, not just project proponents. Wearing my state hat, back then it was a golden triangle of the community, the project proponent, and government, and just different people talking sort of across each other. How do we make sure that people are really heard, and that we work towards solutions?
Yeah, super. Well, that's a great segue into my final question, which we will wrap up this discussion with. We've had a great question in from the audience. Can you share more about how your organizations are building partnerships and collaborating across industry, education, policy, investment, etc.? And then the real question is, who is missing from this conversation who you would really like to see at the table when it comes to climate equity? Who are we not talking to that we should be talking to? Who wants to kick off? Go on. All right, Jen, why don't we kick off with you? Who's missing from the conversation?
Sure, give me the hard part. Can I talk about the partnerships? So I think, the Bristol Community College is really excited and lucky to have so many partnerships. We have a partnership with Mayor's Training. We have European partnerships. We work with the developers. We work with OEMs. We work with community-based organizations. We have a Connect for Wind initiative that has 6 higher eds that are working together to work on wind. So I feel like going back to what both Roseanne and Kerry were just talking about is the stuff that's really hard is the stuff that I'd really like to continue working on. How do we really get everybody to the table in a way that it's equitable? And so we have these great conversations, and we talk about we want everybody to be at the table, but it's really hard to make sure that there is access and there are people at the table to speak in every way for all these underrepresented groups. So I think for me, that will continue to be a focus of ours. And we'll continue to look at how we can make sure that the U.S. has as much focus on, again, I go to workforce, but to continue to make sure that our workforce has as much opportunity in the U.S. But in terms of who's missing at the table, I feel like we're meeting with everyone we possibly can to talk about the importance of this. So I'm sure my panelists can pull out somebody really important that's missing.
Yeah, I would just add, when we think about brown and green space, we think of careers. And so it's places like Bristol, but, here in the Boston area, we're working with Benjamin Franklin Institute of Technology to do a lot of the same things you're talking about. Companies, and so corporate partners, I think they're there, but I think we can do a better job. And so I think we can dig deeper and bring them more to the table. I talked about that venture community and sort of entrepreneurship and innovation. How do we brown that space more? Peter, when I talked about Nubian Square versus Kendall Square, Kendall Square was a lot wider, a lot more men, and so how can we, bring some of that to bear? And then I think I think this is corporate as well, around contracting and supply diversity. And then, lastly, Roseanne is definitely representing, communities, but like, how can we do more to support, the Green Roots and the Neighbors to Neighbors and the ACEs? And because I know, that is tough work, and they're oftentimes underfunded, and there's just a lot of work. And so how can we make the system work better? So the people on the ground who are doing a lot of the work can actually get compensated for that, so it can be more sustainable.
Great. Kerry, thank you. I said that was going to be the last question. It wasn't quite accurate because we've had another really good question, and actually it's for you, Kerry. So I'm just going to ask it to you, and then we will properly wrap up. The question is about you talked about making sure that offshore wind and retrofit jobs are equitable. How do you track equity in green goods, as you said, when there isn't such an obvious economic opportunity in the retrofit sector like there is in offshore wind? The question says, is it sort of stagnant until there's a big change in the retrofit sector?
Yeah, and I'm going to look to our neighbors to the south. New York. I run an accelerator, and one of the people who just came through, and you can go look and learn a little bit more about what they're doing. Donnell Barrett at Block Power is doing some really great work in deep energy retrofits. Heat pumps. Really trying to go and train a lot of people. That's the other thing. Bristol and Benjamin Franklin Institute of Technology, they're getting degrees. A lot of these positions don't even need degrees. There can be certifications. So we should be hiring more people in our community. It's a lot of really tough work to do, but I think if you get the right partnerships, you get the right funding, because it saves money. This isn't the low-hanging fruit. This is the fruit on the ground. And not just that, it saves lives. That's what Roseanne was talking about with COVID. If people are living in, places where they don't have the right setups, or the exhaust is bad, or their fossil fuels, I talked to plenty of grandmothers whose grandkids are in, the emergency room, for asthma. That just doesn't happen. That's because of where they live and the things that are there. And so it makes perfect sense for us to invest in these places, to just make, it makes energy sense, it makes social sense, it makes environmental sense. It's just the right thing to do.
I think that's a great point to end on. Jen, Matt, Roseanne, Kerry, thank you very much indeed for being such a fantastic panel and bringing your considerable experience and expertise to bear on this question of climate justice, economic and environmental equity. So a huge thank you to you. We've talked a lot about partnerships. We at the British Consulate are hugely grateful to all of you for your partnership with us. And we hope that in our own small way that we're giving some sort of international kind of angle to the work that you're doing, because it has so many, it resonates so well, I think, with the work that we're doing in the UK. So if there is ever anything that we can do at the consulate to further support your work, please do let us know. And finally, I wanted to thank, I hope she's still with us, our keynote speaker today, Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey, for her fantastic remarks and her extraordinary contribution here in the Commonwealth. And very finally, a big word of thanks to all of those who have worked in the background to help make this event a success. It always looks like it runs smoothly, but it never does without a huge amount of work in the background. So thank you to everybody who has helped make this event a success. Thank you all very much. I wish you a very good afternoon.